Okay, so 6.5 or 6.6 is solving by factoring. So when we're solving by factoring, we want to make sure that we understand the form that the equation has to be in when you solve by factoring. So the equation has to be equal to 0. And you're going to always look to see if you have a term that has an exponent other than a 1. So previously we learned how to solve equations where we had a variable component that was maybe like x plus 4 equals 2. So you have a variable component where there's no exponent other than a 1 on the variable. So we just isolate and solve like that, okay? But when we're solving by factoring, there's a process that we have to go through. So first we have to make sure that the equation is set equal to 0. So when you have a problem that you're going to have to solve by factoring, you want to make sure that the equation is always equal to 0. So here the equation is equal to 0. So you have to make sure it's equal to 0 because then you have to factor. So you're going to factor what we have on the left side. So we have 5x squared plus 7x plus 2. So you factor however you factor. So I'm going to do my a times c. So factors of 10, that'll give me a 7, will be 5 and 2. So I'm going to do 5x squared plus 5x plus 2x plus 2. Factor out the GCF for each group. My parentheses match, so I know I'm correct. So I factor, and then I'm going to bring down my equal 0, right? So once you factor, that's step 2. Step 3 is that you set each factor equal to 0. And then you solve for each variable that you have in each equation. So here I have 2 separate equations now. And so I'm going to solve for each x in each equation. So I minus 1 on both sides. And then here, subtract 2 first, right? Because the goal is to do what? Isolate the variable. So x is equal to negative 2/5. So your answers would be negative 1 and negative 2/5. So solving by factoring. Solving by factoring. Okay? All right, let's look at this one. X squared plus 12x is equal to negative 36. So what's going on here is when we first look at this problem, we would have to solve it by factoring. How do we know that? Because we have a exponent other than a 1 in the equation. So once you know that you have to factor, then you start going through your steps for solving by factoring. Is the equation equal to 0? So in this case, it is not. So we have to make it equal 0. So we're going to do x squared plus 12x, what? Plus 36 is equal to 0 because it's negative 36. So how does the 36 move to the other side? We would add it to itself, which would create the 0, and we would add it to the left side. But there's no like term, so we just write the values or the terms in descending order. So now since my equation is equal to 0, what can we do? Well, we can factor. So we factor. Factors of 36, that will give us a 12. X plus 6, x plus 6. So we have x plus 6 is equal to 0. X plus 6 times x plus 6 is equal to 0. So now we would just take each factor and set it equal to 0. So x would be equal to negative 6. So you get negative 6 twice, but you would only need to write it one time. Okay? So solving by factoring, you have to make sure that the equation equals 0, then you factor it. Then once you factor, you set each factor to 0 and solve accordingly using your rules from chapter 2. Okay? All right, let's look at some more. All right, let's look at these 3 problems. So first we're going to start here at this x minus 6 times x plus 7 equals 0. So when we look at this problem, it is equal to 0. So then when we look at the left side, it's already factored for us. So we know it's factored because we have two sets of parentheses. We have things being multiplied. So it's already factored and equals 0. So then what do? Well, we just go to the next step, which is what? Set each factor to 0. And then we solve. So we're going to solve for x minus 6 equals 0. We're trying to isolate x. So x equals 6. Here we're trying to solve for x. So we're going to isolate by moving the 7. So we get 6 and negative 7. So that particular example, your problem was already factored. It equaled 0, and then when you went to factor it, it was already factored. So you just move to the next step. All right. Then here, number 2, 5x squared minus 2x is equal to 0. So here we have to look at this. We have an exponent of a 2 present, which means we're going to have to solve by factoring. So we check the equation is equal to 0. So then the next step would be that we would factor it. So when we look at this, it's a binomial, which means two terms. Let's see, is there a GCF? Yes, there is. So we factor out the GCF, which is an x. So then we look at the parentheses. Can we factor further? No, we cannot. So that means this problem is finished factoring, right? So then we set each factor equal to 0. So x equals 0. 5x minus 2 equals 0. And then we solve. Well, the first one is finished because the x is already isolated. So x equals 0, and then what else is x equal to? So here we're going to add 2 to both sides and then divide by 5. So x is equal to 2/5. So we get 0 and 2/5 for that answer. Okay. All right. Then on this third one, we have 3x times x minus 8 is equal to 0. So when we look at this problem, we don't have any exponents of 2 or anything. So we look at it, and the equation is equal to 0, and it's in a factored form. So we're just going to jump to part 3 because this is already factored for us, but we have to be able to set each factor equal to 0. So sometimes students distribute. If you distribute this problem, then you would end up with an exponent, which would then say, oh crap, I have to factor this. So then you would have to factor it. And then you back at what you started with. So now you would do what? Set each factor to 0. And solve. Okay? So divide both sides by 3. X is 0. Add 8. X is 8. So x can be 0 or x can be 8. Okay? So when you separate your factors, you realize that you're creating two separate equations. Every factor creates its own equation when we're solving by factoring. Okay. All right, let's do some more. Okay, so let's look at these two. X cubed minus 12x plus 32x is equal to 0. So here, this equation is set equal to 0. Oh, this should be an x squared here. And when we look at this, we have exponents other than 1, so we know we're going to have to solve by factoring. So when we look at this, it's already equal to 0, so we know we need to factor the left side. So when we look at it, there's a greatest common factor on this problem, so we factor out the x. And then we factor what's remaining in the parentheses, right? So you always make sure you factor completely. So factors of 32, that'll give us a 12, would be a 4 and an 8. So a negative 4 and a negative 8. So we have our problem completely factored. So then we set each factor equal to 0. So we have 3 different equations here, correct? And so we solve for each equation. So the first one is finished because the x is already isolated. In the second equation, what would I have to do? I would have to add 4. And then in the last one, we would add the 8. So our answers would be 0, 4, and 8 for our final answers, okay? And there's a key here. When you look at the exponent, the leading exponent in each problem, that exponent will tell you how many answers you should have. So basically, I should end up with 3 answers because I started with an exponent to the 3rd power. If I have a exponent to the 2nd power, then I know I should have 2 answers, okay? If you have no exponent at all, which means an exponent of 1, that's when we just have basic equations and we won't have to factor anything. We'll just have a single answer when we solve for x. So on the second one here, we have x squared minus 15 is equal to negative 2x. So we see we have an exponent of a 2, which means we're going to have to solve by factoring. Well, the first step is to always make sure the equation is equal to 0. This equation is not equal to 0, so we have to do what? We have to move the 2x. So I'm going to move the 2x by adding it to both sides. So we get x squared. Now this is important. We want the problem in descending order, so the 2x should go second. Now, if you put it in the last position, that's fine, but then you have to know that you have to rewrite it. So if you do this, that's fine, but then you have to factor, and the rules of factoring says make sure your problem is in descending order. So then once you have this written, x squared minus 15 plus 2x equals 0, then you should end up having it written in descending order. So x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0. So now we're going to factor. So factors of 15, that'll give us a 2. So a negative 5 and a plus 3 would not work because that would give me a negative 2. So I'm going to need a plus 5 and a negative 3. That would give me a plus 2. So it's factored, so we set each factor equal to 0. So x would equal negative 5 and x would equal positive 3. So negative 5 and positive 3 would be the final answers. Okay? And that is how we solve by factoring.